This is me. This is you, if you're a Christian. What we've just heard read. Now, let me make sure you don't hear me saying what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that Christians live only in defeat. What I am saying is no Christian lives in continual victory. And this text is describing those moments, those seasons, those times when sin gets the upper hand and we are temporarily, as Christians, defeated. That's what I think he's talking about here. And the text is valuable not only to give us the sober biblical realism about ourselves, but to instruct us how we should then respond to those moments. What should we do? How should we feel about ourselves? And Paul illustrates, I think, every time you fail to do what you know you ought to do, or feel what you know you ought to feel, or think what you know you ought to think, you ought to do this. You ought to say, I love your law. And then you ought to say, I hate what I just did. I'm sorry. And then you ought to say, wretched man or wretched woman that I am, who's going to deliver me from this body of death? And then you ought to say, Jesus Christ is going to get the victory and deliver me from this tortured, imperfect Christian life of mine someday. That's the way you ought to talk about yourself when you fail, which is every day. No Christian wants to live this way. No Christian settles to live this way. But if you do for a time, an hour, a moment, a day, a week, live this way, look, as a church, can we just agree we're not going to lie about it? We're not going to become hypocrites. We're not going to do a lot of posing, a lot of boasted perfectionism. We're not going to put on churchy, pasted smiles that all is okay. A lot of chipper superficiality. May the Lord deliver us from blindness of our own failures and the consequent quickness to judge other people, right? If you are oblivious to your Romans 7 personality, you'll be a judgmental person for sure. Always your finger in somebody else's face and almost never saying, wretched man that I am, who's going to deliver me? So let's just cultivate a sense of the tightrope or the razor's edge of the Christian life. I am laboring in this text to push you away from the pride of perfectionism toward humility and away from the hopelessness of perfectionism toward hope. I'm working on two sides here. There's the perfectionistic type that think they're doing okay, and there's the absolutely desperate, hopeless folks who think they'll never measure up and there's no use trying. And I'm pushing from both directions here because we've got a biblical realism in the book of Romans that's not over here with perfectionism. It's not over here with despair and hopelessness. It's here with humble hopefulness. We're trying to weave our way in a biblical way of reality in this fallen world that's very inhospitable to holiness, to rescue people from hopeless despair who chuck Christianity not because they don't believe it's true, but because they don't believe it's possible. And the others over here that think they've got it in their back pocket. As though there's no fight, there's no labor, there's no difficulty, there's no trembling. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Where's that in their lives? So, that's where we've been. I read a book on vacation by William Wilberforce, who many of you remember from 200 years ago, spent 5 decades of his life trying to overcome the slave trade in England. That's what he's known for. He's a member of Parliament for almost 50 years. And he wrote a book called A Practical View of Christianity. Been republished now. It was published in 1797. And now it's been republished in 1996. And it is a very good book. Typical 18th century English. An absolutely stunning thing to me that it became an immediate bestseller. And I can barely read it. Which says something about how low our standards have become over the last 200 years. And the other thing amazing about this book is that I don't think there's a politician in the world today who could write a book like this. Because it is so incredibly spiritually discerning and sensitive and saturated with the Bible. The reason I mention it to you is because he talked in numerous places about Romans 7. I didn't read it for that reason. I'm going to lecture on Wilberforce at the Pastors' Conference. That's why I'm reading it. And here are 2 quotes. He was trying to persuade the Christian nominal church of his day in England that they were all depraved and needed to have a deeper sense of their own remaining corruption as Christians. And he said, one testimony to this is that every watchful, diligent, self-denying Christian will tell you, quote, that every day strengthens this conviction. Yea, that hourly he sees fresh reason to deplore his lack of simplicity in intention, his infirmity of purpose, his low views, his selfishness, his unworthy desires, his backwardness to set about his duty, his languor and coldness in performing it, that he finds himself obliged continually to confess that he feels within him 2 opposite principles and that he cannot do the things that he would. That's Wilberforce's description of the best Christian. One other quote. He says there is in every believer a seminal principle, that's his phrase, a seed principle of new life in Christ. And it is threatened on all hands because we live, he says, in a highly inhospitable atmosphere on earth to the fruit growing of holiness. It's like trying to grow a peach tree from Georgia in Minnesota. There isn't one here. But if God were to plant it here, it would grow. And it would bear peaches. Against all odds, and they would probably be tiny and not very juicy, like much of your fruit is living in the wintry world called planet Earth that is governed by the God of this age, and the world and the flesh and the devil are mounting every effort against your fruit bearing every hour of every day to keep you from being a Christian like you ought to be. And so he says in this atmosphere, quote, while the servants of Christ continue in this life, glorious as is the issue of their labors, they receive many humiliating reminders of their remaining imperfections and daily find reason to confess that they cannot do the things that they would. End quote.